I have lived too long among walls that no longer remember. In corridors where footsteps echo like prayers for the soul's history erased. Here, in the place they call Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum, time does not move forward. It seeps backward, through dust and parchment, through the sigh of candles that have burned for lies. Every scroll sleeps like the bone of someone who once knew too much. And I was one of them, a copyist, not out of faith, but out of fear. Fear that if I stopped writing, truth itself would die without ever knowing it had lived. Tonight, I sit in the last chamber of the library, between shelves heavy with wax smoke and dying paper. The only light comes from a trembling oil lamp reflected in a brass plate engraved with the words, Veritas vos liberabit. The truth shall set you free. But I have learned, not every truth wishes to be freed. Some secrets the church did not burn with fire, it buried them in silence. Some bloodlines were not drained to sanctify, but to forget. I have seen sealed manuscripts signed under false names. Urns marked Heretica Genealogia, heretical lineage. I have read letters stamped by popes commanding, bury it, do not burn it, as though even God feared what had been written. And among the ashes, I found them, the ones history calls the Meravvenians. Not a dynasty, but a wound. Not a legend, but the residue of a prophecy that refused to die. They say they were barbarian kings, long-haired, half Christian, half wild, their crowns forged from iron and incense. But in the margins of forgotten gospels, another story breathes, that their blood was not merely anointed, but consecrated, born of something older, holier than divine right. A lineage the Vatican tried to erase, not with swords, but with the slow anesthesia of forgetting. I do not know why I was chosen to see these things. Perhaps God, in his cruel symmetry, left me as the last witness, or the last accomplice. All I know is this: if I stay silent, memory will rot with me. And if I speak, I will burn as they did. Between fear and faith, I choose neither. I choose testimony. So I write, to tell the story the Vatican sealed in silence. The story of a royal bloodline marked by prophecy, and of the Church's greatest sin, the sin of denying the memory of God himself. If you are reading these words, I am already gone. But remember this: no fire burns blood completely, and no prayer can keep memory asleep forever. I opened the door they told me never to open. And behind it, I did not find the devil, I found the history of God. Part I. The long-haired kings and the prophecy burned in silence. They first appear not in history books, but in the dust between them, a mosaic in a ruined chapel, a marginal note in a monk's chronicle, a whisper stitched into parchment, Rex Crinitus, the long-haired kings, before Charlemagne. Before the clean geometry of Rome's rebirth, there were the Meravvenians, half-pagan, half-Christian rulers who walked the border between myth and memory. Their hair was their crown, their sacrament. To cut it was to strip the divine from flesh, to exile a man not from his throne, but from the grace of heaven itself. The Church once adored them. In those trembling centuries after Rome's collapse, when the world still smelled of smoke and iron, the Meravvenians offered the bishops a story they could live with, kings chosen by heaven, protectors of Christendom, wielding power not through conquest, but through consecration. Their anointing was ritual, their blood, a covenant, but covenants age badly when they outlive their usefulness. Somewhere between the baptism of Clovis and the coronation of Pepin, affection soured into embarrassment. The old songs of sacred blood began to sound like heresy. The long-haired kings, once saints in waiting, became awkward relics of a faith too ancient, too mystical, too uncontrolled. Erasure began quietly. A saint's name omitted from a feast calendar. A shrine renovated into oblivion. Then came the rewriting. Chroniclers who once wrote in reverence began to mock. The same voices that had called the kings chosen now called them obsolete. And yet beneath that silence, a rumor lingered, a prophecy murmured in cloisters and copied into the margins of forbidden gospels. The line of the sea-born king shall not die, but sleep. And when the church crowns itself the only voice of God, the blood it buried shall return to speak. A foolish tale, perhaps. But foolish tales have long half-lives in the bones of men. I found traces of it in the Chronica Fretigari, a fragment dismissed as a dying monk's delirium. He wrote of the beast of the sea, whose child would be hidden by heaven, whose descendants would rise not by sword, but by sanctity. The church called it apocalyptic poetry. But what if it was not prophecy? What if it was memory, an inheritance too dangerous to name? Because prophecy, like blood, does not vanish. It seeps. Even centuries later, when the Meravvenians had turned to dust and rumor, their symbols endured, the wild lily carved on tombs, the raven etched beside a chalice, marks priests were ordered to ignore, yet never quite erased. As if memory itself were defying its editors. Rome does not burn what it fears most. It buries it. And in those burials, the sealed crypts, the redacted annals, the uncanonized martyrs, silence thickened until it became alive. I have read their silences. They speak more loudly than hymns. The long-haired kings are gone, shorn, dethroned, sanctified by omission. But their prophecy remains, pulsing beneath the marble like a heartbeat. They said their reign ended with the scissors. But blood remembers. And what the church forgets, it dreams. Part 2. The exiled king and the dreams of fire. He was born beneath a winter sky, the air heavy with iron and omen. Dagobert, son of Sigebert III, heir to a kingdom already cracking beneath its own sanctity. The monks who recorded his birth wrote that the chapel candles flickered blue, a bad sign. But one old scribe, his hand trembling, dared to add a note in the margin. Some lights change color when the divine draws near. When Dagobert was still a boy, his name became too heavy for the court to bear. A child of prophecy is useful only when he is obedient or dead. He was neither. So they sent him away. Exile disguised as education to Ireland, that cold monastery at the edge of the world, where the air smelled of salt and rot and revelation, among monks who dreamed in Latin and wept in silence. Dagobert learned to read not the scriptures, but their margins. And in those margins, he began to see himself. The Irish monks kept an older faith, wilder, closer to the bone. They believed the soul spoke through vision, that God hid not in words but in dreams. Dagobert began to dream of fire and lily, of a tree bleeding gold, of a crown rusting in snow. The abbot called them temptations. But the dreams persisted, sharper each night, as though someone or something was teaching him how to remember. One night he saw her, a woman veiled in pale light, her hair like threads of starlight. She whispered a name he did not yet know, Meravvius. And then, the sea caught fire. When he woke, he was no longer a boy. He was a man haunted by inheritance. Years later, he returned to his homeland. A king reclaimed, a ghost resurrected. But prophecy makes poor armor. His throne was a trap. The church smiled as it anointed him, But the oil burned colder than before. He ruled, but he was watched. He prayed, but he was not heard. Then came the final dream, the one no one dared to write. He stood in a forest of iron trees, their roots dripping blood. A raven perched upon a broken crown and whispered, "They will cut your hair before they cut your throat." Behind him, the sea boiled again, the same sea from his childhood, where the divine once swam like a serpent. When he told the monks, they called it madness. When he told the bishops, they called it blasphemy. When he told his heart, it fell silent. In the spring of 679, Dagobert rode into the woods near Sten. A hunt, they said. Hours later, his horse returned without a rider. An arrow through the eye, they whispered. A death too clean to be an accident. The church said little. No feast day. No saint's title. Just a blank page where his name should have been. But silence, too, is a kind of authorship. In the centuries that followed, stories of the sleeping king drifted through the villages of Gaul. They said his body never rotted, that his wound glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, that his blood was buried not in earth, but in promise. In a secret hymn, smuggled from Tours, the final verse reads, "He sees without eyes. He speaks without breath. His crown is hidden, but not gone." Even now in the archives, there is a note written by a trembling monk centuries later. "Do not open the tomb at Sten. The prophecy was not extinguished, only sealed." Perhaps that was when the Vatican first learned. You cannot kill a story. You can only bury it alive. The chronicles say he was forgotten. But I have touched the parchment. The ink still smells of smoke. Part 3. The Coup of Silence. How the Church rewrote blood into doctrine. It happened quietly. No crusade, no pyre, no trumpet of judgment, only the hush of ink drying on papal parchment. The year was 751. Europe was still crawling from Rome's long shadow. And somewhere between faith and necessity, the Vatican performed its first immaculate deception. For more than 2 centuries, the Meravvenian Kings had ruled Gaul, sacred monarchs whose right to reign was said to descend not from conquest, but from consecrated blood. Their hair was their covenant, their anointing a bridge between heaven and flesh. They were not crowned. They were sanctified, but sanctity is a dangerous currency. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be replaced. So the church minted a new coin. The king then, Childeric III, was a phantom, a name without power, a throne without weight. Real authority belonged to the mayors of the palace, stewards who ruled in all but title. Behind one of them stood a man whose faith was sharper than the Pope's own crown. Pepin, called the Short, a soldier, a strategist, a believer not in heaven, but in the machinery that pretended to lead there. Rome needed protection. Pepin needed legitimacy. And so, an unholy bargain was sealed in letters no eyes were meant to read. In one such document, its wax seal long melted into blackened parchment, Pope Zachary answered Pepin's question: who should be king? The one who wears the crown, or the one who wields the power? His reply was brief, terrifying in its clarity. It is better that he who holds power be called king, than he who is powerless. With that single sentence, 1,000 years of sacred lineage were severed. Childeric's long hair, that holy tether between blood and divinity, was cut by a bishop's hand. The gesture was both execution and exorcism. They say he wept as the blades sheared through the last filament of heaven's touch. Then he was sent to a monastery where he died nameless, his tomb unmarked. And Rome anointed Pepin, not by birthright, but by permission. Not with sacred inheritance, but with papal oil. That day, the Vatican discovered something more potent than prophecy. Bureaucracy. From then on, no king would reign without Rome's blessing. The altar had conquered the throne. And the story, the myth of divine blood, was rewritten, line by line, until memory itself obeyed. The monks obeyed. The chroniclers obeyed. Even the dead obeyed. Dagobert's tomb was sealed. The shrines of his ancestors rededicated. Relics once kissed by pilgrims were reclassified as pagan trinkets. And the word Meravvenian became first a footnote, then a stain, then nothing. But the church's sin was not the coup. It was the silence that followed. A year later in Neustria, a council met and drafted a decree. Only fragments survive. Among them, a line colder than any inquisition. No sanctity without sanction. Sanctity, that spark once believed to dwell in blood, in vision, in the living grace of kings, was now property of the church. To believe otherwise was heresy. Yet even in victory, they feared what they had killed. For power founded on permission is fragile, and faith built on silence remembers too much, hidden within private Vatican. Correspondence, letters never meant for theologians, but for wardens, is one attributed to Pope Stephen II. It warns of prophecies circulating in Gaul of a returning king whose blood is unbroken. His instruction to bishops is chillingly simple. Extinguish the tale. Let no relic remain unexamined. The blood must not remember itself. The coup, then, was not merely political. It was surgical, a transfusion of legitimacy. Divine right drained from flesh and poured into paper. The church did not only remove a dynasty, it rewrote the definition of holiness itself. They say Pepin was crowned twice, once by Boniface, once by Rome. But the true coronation was not of a man. It was of an idea, that power could be made holy by decree. Part 4. The Twin Trees and the Forbiddance Poem. It begins, as so many dangerous things do. In metaphor, a brittle folio in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, catalogued simply as Codex 8411, Arboribus Geminis, of the Twin Trees. A poem, unsigned, unclaimed, written in the Latin of monks who feared their own ink dot at first glance. It reads like a homily, the kind copied by novices to practice their pen strokes. Two trees, planted on a hill, their roots entwined beneath the soil. One blossoms with lily, the other bleeds sap the color of rust. But there is something wrong in its rhythm, a trembling, a hesitation, as though the words themselves are hiding. In the poem, the trees are not rivals. They are brothers. Both draw from the same ground. Yet a wind from the east strikes the one crowned with lily. It bends, but does not break. The other, proud and dark, blooms once more, bearing a single golden fruit. When that fruit is plucked, both trees vanish in light. A simple allegory, scholars said. Virtue versus pride. But it lingers too long in the mind. For in the language of the early Franks, the lily, lilium, was never merely a flower. It was a bloodline. The emblem of the Meravvenians and the bleeding tree. That is the church itself, not bleeding for mankind, but bleeding the memory of kings. The oldest copy bears a marginal note, scrawled by a monk whose hand shakes across centuries. Fructus redditus, the fruit of return. Not redemption, return, a strange word, a dangerous one. For in the theology of the 8th century, return could mean only one thing: resurrection. not of bodies, but of rights. And that perhaps is why the poem was hidden. A later catalog in the Vatican's Index Prohibitorum lists archivist Geminis under the heading Prophetia Ineptae, inconvenient prophecies. No explanation, only an instruction, suppressed without debate. But the poem did not die. It resurfaced 3 times. In monasteries centuries apart, each version slightly altered, as though rewritten from memory. Each time, the twin trees return with the same cryptic refrain. From the blood of the veiled king shall rise the fruit not born of time, but of memory. The veiled king, a phrase that appears in no chronicle, yet always near the word Meravvius. Coincidence is a coward's refuge. A 12th century copy adds an illumination. A hilltop church flanked by 2 trees, their roots intertwining to form the shape of a crown. Beneath them, a hidden stream carries 3 floating crowns. 2 cracked, 1 whole. It seems like allegory, until you realize it is a map. The hill resembles St. Denis. The stream, the Seine. The crowns, Meravvenian, Carolingian, Papal. A warning, then, or a promise. I imagine the monk who drew it, scratching by candlelight, glancing at the door between every line. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't writing a poem. He was smuggling a prophecy past the guards of memory. Some scholars have called Archivist Geminis the first coded rebellion. They are wrong. It was not rebellion. It was remembrance. The church could condemn an idea. It could burn a heretic. But it could not excommunicate a metaphor. And so the prophecy lived, disguised as poetry, hidden in liturgy, whispered by monks who pretended not to understand their own verses. They copied it not because they believed, but because belief had already chosen them. 2 trees share 1 root, 1 crowned with lily, 1 bleeding into the earth. When the fruit is taken, both will vanish in light. It is not a warning. It is a memory of what was promised. Part V. Boniface and the Letters of Fear. There are saints whose miracles are not of light, but of erasure. Boniface was one of them. The church remembers him as the apostle of the Germans, the holy reformer who felled the pagan oak at Geismar and built a chapel on its roots. But the oak was only the first tree he cut down. He would spend the rest of his life clearing the wild forest of older faiths, those tangled, ancient beliefs where prophecy, blood, and divinity still intertwined. It was said he carried 2 things, a gospel and a knife. One to convert, the other to correct. The Vatican called him its sword. But in the private letters that remain, written in cramped Latin, folded so tightly they were nearly invisible, sealed with wax long since melted into the parchment, he called himself something else. Custa Silenti, the custodian of silence. He wrote often to Pope Zachary, his tone wavering between confession and justification. In one letter, dated 744, he describes a monastery in Thuringia where young brethren sing forbidden verses of kings who shall return. He asks, "Shall I purge the hymn or the singers?" The Pope's reply is lost, or perhaps destroyed, but Boniface's next letter begins with only 3 words. The voices have ceased. That was the rhythm of his correspondence. Question. Obedience. Silence. One of his last surviving letters is not addressed to any pope, but to his friend Fulrad of St. Denis. The tone softens, almost human. I have seen too much of God's handwriting corrected by man, and I no longer know which ink is holy. The letter was never sent. It was found sealed inside his own copy of the Liber Pontificalis, a volume now kept under glass in the Vatican Library. Its margins are crowded with red marks and sigils. A small cross here. A drop-shaped mark beside the name of Dagobert. And a single word written 3 times, Memor. Remember. The official record says Boniface died in 754. Struck down by Frisian pagans while preaching the gospel. They say his body was found kneeling, the gospel raised as a shield. But a buried annal from Utrecht tells another story. He did not pray. He waited. He said, "Let the silence end with me." Some scholars whisper that near the end he began to doubt, that he realized the silence he had built would one day become the church's prison. The letters of fear, as they are now called, were his attempt to confess before the truth buried him to. Yet the Vatican preserved them. Not in public archives, but in the restricted Archivio Sanguinis, the blood archive. Why preserve what you wish forgotten? Perhaps because even the church understood. Destruction feeds myth, but silence starves it. I have read those letters. The ink has faded to the color of dried blood. Each trembles with something unsaid, as though the parchment itself remembers what Boniface could not speak aloud. In one half-erased passage. Barely visible, the words survive. If the tree of memory is cut, another shall grow from its root. Only when both are burned shall the wound close. The tree again. Always the tree. From the Forbiddens poem, from the seals of the Meravvenians, from Dagobert's dreams. The same root, stretching through centuries of concealment. Boniface was canonized, of course. The church could not allow its greatest architect of silence to vanish unblessed. It is easier to worship what one cannot forgive. Even now, pilgrims light candles before his relics. They pray for strength, for obedience. None of them know that the saint they invoke once trembled before a secret older than his faith. His letters never preached. They confessed. He feared heresy, but feared memory more. For once memory wakes, it is resurrection. Part 6, the redacted gospel I founded by accident. Or perhaps, as I have come to suspect, it found me. The manuscript lay misfiled in a crate labeled Apocrypha, Greek fragments 9th century. Its binding was crude, its ink uneven, its pages reeking faintly of smoke and salt. To any librarian, it would have seemed unremarkable, another stray relic of half-orthodox scripture. But I recognized the hand. The script was not Greek at all, but a hybrid, half Latin, half cipher. The same trembling hand that had written one of Boniface's final letters. The first line was familiar, almost comforting. In principio, erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. But the next line was not from John. It read, "And the Word took blood, and the blood remembered." Everything changed. This was no gospel of Christ. It was the gospel of the blood itself. A retelling of the Passion through a voice unnamed, a disciple neither counted nor canonized. He spoke not of betrayal or crucifixion, but of a covenant rewritten, of a church that would one day mistake power for divinity. In one passage, the anonymous scribe writes, "The kingdom is not of heaven, but of the blood that remembers heaven." Blasphemy, perhaps, but perhaps also a key. Between the lines, written in faded red pigment, are marginal notations, short, broken phrases half erased, half whispered. Meravvenius ex sanguine. The living covenant. Hide the lineage, not the word. It was then I understood. This was no apocrypha. It was a redacted gospel, one that had once belonged to the canon, before being bled out of it. Every few lines, deliberate erasures. Whole sentences scraped into oblivion, their ghosts visible only under a slant of light. When I tilted the parchment beneath the lamp, faint Latin rose from the fibers like breath. Et regnum aegis erit in sanguine, et non in verbo. And his kingdom shall be in blood, not in word. I have spent nights trying to trace the author. Some say it was written by an Irish monk, one who sheltered Dagobert in exile. Others whisper it was Fulred, Boniface's friend, copying in penance what his master destroyed. But the style no. The rhythm feels older, as though it were written by someone who saw. What haunts me most is the ending. Not the words, they are gone, but the ink that remains. The final line trails off mid-stroke, as if the scribe had been interrupted or silenced. A later hand, perhaps from the 13th century, scrawled across the bottom in furious script, "Deleture." Erase it. And yet, they did not burn it. They hid it. That is the Vatican's truest ritual, not destruction, but containment. Every forbidden text becomes a reliquary of fear. Every redaction, a prayer whispered to time. Forget this. But time does not forget. It only waits. When I compared its phrases to the canonical Gospels, a pattern emerged. Where the official text speaks of spirit, this one speaks of memory. Where it says word, this one says blood. Spirit becomes memory. Word becomes blood. Faith becomes inheritance. And then, between two erased verses, the faint trace of a seal. A sigil shaped like twin trees and a crown. The same symbol from Arboribus Geminis. The same mark carved on the ring found in Dagobert's crypt. The redacted gospel was not only heresy. It was proof that the church had not merely hidden a prophecy. It had edited scripture itself to erase it. They told us the word became flesh. But perhaps the flesh spoke first. And the word, fearing its own echo, rewrote itself. Part 7. The archivist's revelation. It happened the night the storm broke over Rome. Thunder rolled through the marble like a slow heartbeat. Rain hammered against the narrow windows of the Archivum Apostolicum, as if the sky itself demanded entry. I had been working alone, or so I believed. The corridor that leads to the sealed rooms is soundless, lined with cabinets of vellum and glass. You don't walk there, you drift. Each step is swallowed by centuries. No dust, no echo. Only the quiet breathing of paper that refuses to die. It was close to midnight when I saw it. A faint phosphorescence bleeding through a crack in the stone behind cabinet 47. Deletions. I had passed that wall 100 times. It was supposed to be solid, but the light moved. And with it, a sound, a low mechanical sigh, the churn of hidden gears. When I pressed my hand to the seam, the marble was warm. Behind it lay a chamber smaller than a chapel, lined with iron drawers. No catalog, no index, only a tarnished bronze plate, engraved with a single name. Fons M. I had heard whispers of it among the archivists, the Forbiddens collection, the graveyard of memory. I knew what I was doing was treason. But curiosity has its own liturgy, and that night, I was a willing disciple. The first drawer resisted, then slid open with a hiss, a breath released after centuries. Inside lay rows of sealed envelopes, crimson wax stamped with an inverted papal crest. Each was labeled in a trembling hand. De Prophetia Sanguinis, on the prophecy of blood. I opened one. It was not parchment. It was skin that thin, treated, inked with Latin that shimmered when lightning flashed through the slit window. The handwriting was ancient, deliberate, heartbreakingly human. Let this be hidden until the blood learns to speak again. Beneath it, in another hand, do not destroy. For to destroy is to confirm. There were dozens, letters, transcripts, confessions, each written by men who had seen something they could not unsee. A bishop in 1311 describing a tomb beneath St. Denis that glowed when prayed over. A nun in 1624 who dreamt of a child with a wound in his side that never bled. A Jesuit in 1903 who claimed to have decoded a psalm foretelling the return of the King of Lily. Every account ended the same way. A command to forget . And then the photograph. Black and white. 1943. A Vatican convoy flanked by German officers, escorting a small reliquary box wrapped in chains. On the back, a handwritten annotation. Sanguis Meravvi. Property of Fons M. Do not expose to light. The blood of Meravvi. The same relic Boniface had written of. The same vial seized from a Pyrenea abbey. It existed. Still, I sat there for hours trembling, surrounded by the whispers of those who had guarded this secret before me. Archivists, priests, scholars, each silenced in turn. Then I saw it. A sheet newer than the rest. Typed, dated 1963. Vatican. Letterhead. To the custodian of M. The line persists. The test results confirm anomalous inheritance markers consistent with the old blood. You are instructed to cease further inquiry. No contact is to be made with the subject. Let the myth sleep. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani stapled. To the letter was a birth certificate. French. 1893. The name was faint but legible. Marie Denarnaud. The housekeeper of Berenger Saunière. The woman who whispered on her deathbed. He could have made kings tremble. She was the subject. And perhaps not the last. As I closed the drawer, I saw movement in the reflection of the bronze plate. A figure stood at the threshold of the chamber, silent, unmoving. Black robes, face obscured, eyes glinting with something colder than faith. He did not speak. He didn't need to. He knew what I had read, and I knew what I had become. Not a scholar, not an archivist, a witness. They built their faith upon silence. But silence is a door, not a wall. And I have already stepped through. Part 8. The hidden tomb beneath St. Denis. The rain followed me from Rome to Paris like a debt unpaid. It soaked the streets, the Seine, the stones, and me. A fugitive archivist clutching a secret the church had spent 1,000 years burying. St. Denis rose before me like an accusation. Its towers vanished into fog. Its windows glowed with the last embers of centuries of prayer. The birthplace of kings, and perhaps their grave. I arrived under the guise of a scholar of medieval architecture. The curator, an old priest named Père Luc, greeted me with cautious courtesy. His hands trembled as he offered a lantern. "You'll find what you're looking for beneath," he said, his voice thin as cracked vellum. "But you won't like what looks back." The crypt smelled of wax and iron. Rows of marble effigies lay in perfect silence. Clovis, Dagobert, Chilbert, saints and sinners, crowned in stone. Yet the air was wrong. Too warm, too alive. At the far wall, behind an altar carved with lily and swords, the mortar had been disturbed. Someone had sealed it recently. I pressed the lantern close. Under soot, faint inscriptions surfaced, Latin half erased by chisel and time. One phrase refused to die, regnum in sanguine latet. The kingdom lies hidden in blood. The wall gave way easily. Behind it, a passage spiraled downward, narrow, airless, slick with centuries. The deeper I went, the older the world became, Roman brick fading into pagan stone. crosses dissolving into serpents. And then I found it. A chamber no wider than a chapel, lit only by water pooling at its center. On the far side stood a sarcophagus unlike any other, black basalt veined with gold, its seams fused with molten lead. No name, no crown, only a single sigil carved into the lid, twin trees entwined around a lily. I brushed away the dust and felt the chill of recognition. The same symbol I had seen in Fon's M, the same that sealed the redacted gospel. The seal of the bloodline. There was an inscription, faint but legible. Here lies the king who is not crowned, whose blood sleeps, not dies. Dagobert too, or what was left of him. A sound broke the stillness. Footsteps on stone. I extinguished the lantern, heart hammering. In the faint reflection of the water, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked, carrying a torch that burned blue. "Do you know what you've opened?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost kind. "I'm searching for the truth," I managed. He smiled sadly. That's what he said too. He placed the torch beside the tomb and drew from his sleeve a vial of dark, viscous liquid. The seal was cracked, the wax old. The label faded but legible. Sanguis Moravi. "The church never destroyed it," he whispered. "They kept it here, where even God forgets to look." Before I could speak, he poured a single drop onto the sarcophagus. It spread like ink, tracing the sigil, pulsing, alive. Then silence. A tremor beneath the floor. The pool rippled. The torchlight flickered. And from within the tomb came a sound, faint, brittle, a heartbeat. The man turned to me, eyes filled with reverence and terror. "Once blood remembers," he said. "Faith no longer belongs to Rome." Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark, leaving only the trembling stone behind. I do not remember climbing back to the surface. Only the cold air, the bells tolling above, and Per Luke waiting at the crypt's mouth, his face pale as candle smoke. "You saw him, didn't you?" "Who?" I whispered. "The custodian. The one who never left." He pressed a rosary into my hand, the beads warm, faintly stained red. "Forget this place," he said, "before it remembers you. History does not erase the past. It buries it alive. And sometimes when you dig too deep, the past starts to breathe again." Part 9, The Prophecy in Flesheye, left St. Denis before dawn. The rain had stopped, but the air clung to me like fever. Every sound, a car horn, a church bell, the wind through wet leaves, felt like an echo from that tomb. Something had been awakened, and I could feel it, not in thought, but in bone. At first, I mistook it for fear. Then I understood. It was recognition. 3 nights later, the dreams began. The same one, again and again. I stand in a hall of water and light, the chamber beneath St. Denis, but alive, breathing. The black sarcophagus is open. Inside, not a body, but a mirror. And in the mirror, my own reflection, crowned with lily of fire. A voice whispers, neither male nor female, ancient and unbearably close. Blood remembers what the mind denies. I wake drenched in sweat, the scent of myrrh and iron thick in the air. My palms are cut, though I have no wounds. Each morning, the cuts bleed a little more. I reached out to the only man who might understand, Father Corvin, an excommunicated Jesuit who once translated Forbidden's Merovingian texts before vanishing into the south of France. When he answered my call, his first words were not greeting but warning. "If you've seen the tomb," he said, "you've already been seen in return." We met in a ruined chapel in Carcassonne, half devoured by dust. The candlelight fractured our faces into shifting fragments. "You think the prophecy was about kings," he said. "It wasn't. It was about memory, incarnate memory. The church didn't fear a man. It feared inheritance." He handed me a weathered scroll wrapped in waxed linen, its seal marked with the twin trees and the lily. "This is the Vita Obscura," he whispered. "Copied from the redacted gospel before the purge. It speaks of the return, not as birth, but as recognition." He leaned closer, eyes fever bright. "The blood doesn't resurrect the king. It becomes him." I didn't understand, not then. That night, by candlelight, I unrolled the scroll. The Latin was fragmented, trembling. One passage, written in crimson ink that had not faded, struck through me like a blade. "The last custodian shall awaken when he sees his own blood reflected in the tomb of the silent king." My hand shook. I thought of the drop that touched the sarcophagus. I thought of my palms, bleeding dot, and for the first time, the question that chilled me was not, "What have I found?" It was, "What have I become?" Over the following week, I began to change. My skin paled. My dreams deepened. When I passed churches, the candles turned toward me. When I entered archives, the pages rustled without wind. I told myself it was exhaustion, sleeplessness, guilt, obsession. But reason does not leave burn marks. One morning, I woke with a mark on my wrist. Faint, red, circular. A lily. I returned to St. Denis, drawn by something older than fear. The basilica was closed, but I found a way through the catacombs. Guided not by memory, but by instinct, or by something else. The chamber waited for me. Still, silent, but the sarcophagus was no longer sealed. The pool was gone. The air smelled of salt and wine. Inside the tomb lay not a corpse, but a linen-wrapped scroll. On it, a single line: "The kingdom does not rise. It wakes." My reflection wavered in the black stone. For an instant, another face appeared, older, patient, watching. And beneath my skin, something answered. A pulse. "Not mine. They told us prophecy was metaphor," I whispered. "That blood was only symbol." But what if faith was never meant to be believed, only remembered? I looked down at my hands. The lily mark had darkened, glowing faintly with light that pulsed like breath. The church buried a king. But they forgot, you can bury a man, not a lineage. Part X, the blood that speaks. The human body has two kinds of memory. The one that remembers, and the one that remembers for you. The latter never asks permission. It waits, humming in the marrow, until something, a word, a scent, a drop of blood, wakes it. That was what happened to me. At first, it was only whispers beneath the skin. Fleeting images when I closed my eyes. Oceans boiling. A crown sinking. A child at the gates of Rome holding a lily made of fire. Each night, the visions sharpened, closer, louder, more insistent. And then the voice returned. "You were never reading history. You were reading your reflection." I woke gasping, my palms slick with blood. The mark on my wrist had spread, veins branching like crimson roots, reaching toward my heart. I went to Père Luc one last time. He was waiting in the nave of St. Denis, surrounded by trembling candles. The air was perfectly still. "You've seen too much," he said, his eyes both kind and resigned. The church didn't silence prophecy because it was false. They silenced it because it was unfinished. He lifted the sleeve of his cassock. The same mark. A lily blooming in blood. "We were never its enemies," he whispered. We were its vessels. He led me back into the crypt, deeper than before, through a hidden arch of rough stone that opened into a small, circular chamber. At its center stood an altar of obsidian veined with gold, glinting like frozen lightning. Upon it rested the vial, Sanguis Meravvi. It pulsed faintly, in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Per Luke turned to me. "Every age has a custodian," he said. "Every generation, a voice. But the line cannot return through faith alone. It needs flesh. It needs remembrance." He placed a knife in my hand, simple, old, the blade etched with twin trees. And I understood. Blood remembers what the mind denies. I pressed the blade to my palm. The cut bloomed red. When the first drop fell into the vial, the liquid flared, not crimson, but gold, and for an instant, I saw everything. The sea creature that birthed the dynasty. Clovis, crowned in oil and myth. Dagobert, dying in exile, whispering of return. The monks who hid the prophecy in skin. The archivists who sealed it under marble. Generations who kept it alive in silence, a single thread. Unbroken, winding through centuries, and at its end. M.A. The blood in the vial began to rise, suspended in the air between us, forming words that shimmered like light before dissolving into mist. He who remembers shall reign, not over men, but over memory itself. Then, darkness. When I woke, the vial was empty. The mark on my wrist was gone. But the silence around me had changed. It was no longer absence. It was listening. The prophecy was never about power. It was about continuity, the persistence of memory when faith forgets itself. The blood does not rule. It reminds. And sometimes, to preserve the sacred, it must speak, even through those who never meant to listen. A new archivist enters the sealed chamber in Rome. He pauses before the bronze plate marked Fons M as he reaches to open it. The light flickers, and for a heartbeat, a faint red lily glows beneath his skin, fade to black. Some silences are not empty. They are waiting to be answered. Epilogue: the veiled kingdom. The Vatican is silent tonight. The corridors of the archives stand still as tombs. I walk them not as a fugitive, nor as a scholar, but as something in between, a man whose faith has been rewritten by what he remembers. Every archivist leaves something behind, a marginal note, a missing page, a whisper folded between folders. I am leaving this. My confession. My testimony. The story of a kingdom that never fell, only hid itself. They told us the Merovingians vanished, that their crowns were melted, their blood diluted, their names buried beneath marble and prayer. But blood does not die. It waits. I have seen it waiting, in tombs that breathe, in texts that rewrite themselves by candlelight, in dreams that remember you before you are born. The church built its power on the idea that holiness descends through keys and mitres, through men and decrees. But the older truth, the one it feared, is that sanctity rises from the earth, from blood, from the memory of all who dared to remember. That there is a place, I will not name it, where the relics of the old line are kept. A vial, an altar, a single drop of blood that glows faintly in the dark, like a dying ember that refuses to cool. I stood before it one last time. For a moment, I thought I heard a voice, not divine, not human, but something between. It did not ask for worship. It asked for witness. The kingdom is not lost, it said. It was veiled, not to hide, but to endure. And I understood then, prophecy is never about what will come. It is about what refuses to go away. It is the persistence of the unspoken, the hum beneath history. The Church called it heresy. But heresy, in its oldest tongue, means only to choose. To choose remembrance over obedience. To choose truth over comfort. To choose silence that speaks. I am not the first to carry this memory. And I will not be the last. Someday, perhaps centuries from now, another archivist will find these pages. He will read them beneath a flickering light and wonder if any of it was real. He will trace the twin trees, the lily carved in the margin, and feel something stir in his blood, a faint pulse answering the question he does not yet know how to ask. And when he lifts his hand to the light, he will see it there, faint but alive, a red lily blooming beneath the skin. The veiled kingdom was never a place. It was a memory, a promise whispered through generations of silence. Not of conquest, but of continuity. Not of power, but of remembrance. And perhaps that is all eternity truly is. The moment when memory refuses to die. Fade to black,